Welcome back to Superstition Mountain. In the past few weeks, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of research using gear software into how players move their centers. For this discussion, we have two centers. We've got our lower center, which is the middle of our pelvis, and our upper center, which is kind of in the center of our rib cage. Now, I've looked through and I found some commonalities amongst almost every great ball striker. And what you'll see is early in the backswing, we all have a little bit of sway. And sway means motion slightly to the right. Both the upper center and the lower center move slightly that direction. And they finish that movement, that direction, about shaft parallel. From this point on, the spine extends, the pelvis continues to rotate, and we wind up with the centers more or less stacked on top of each other. You do find players like Sergio Garcia, whose lower center is farther to the right and his upper center is farther to the left, and others like Tony Finau, he's farther to the right and with his upper center and his lower center is farther to the left. Now, what's really cool is in transition, nearly every great ball striker that I've studied gets their upper center forward of their lower center in transition. On the right, we have a multiple-time winner on the PGA Tour, and on the left, we have a very good playing professional. And let's just walk through these golf swings. And these are both 7-irons that these players are hitting, and you can see at address, the upper center of the body is actually slightly forward of the lower center of the pelvis. And as we put this in motion, I've got the rib cage sway numbers and the pelvis sway numbers up. And so we can see how as the player moves the club away, there is some moving away from the target in both the rib cage and the pelvis. The player on the right has a little bit more lateral motion than the player on the left. But in both cases, you can see how stacked up by the top of the backswing those centers are. And the player on the left, he's just basically stacked straight up. And the player on the right is minus 0.2 and minus 0.7. So really, the centers are very stacked up at the top of the backswing. And now you'll see in transition, as they begin to start the other way, the upper center will actually, for a time, get out in front of the lower center of the body. And this is how the high-level players get pressure into the forward foot. Some teachers call this the surfing motion, but they're getting their upper center slightly out in front of their lower center. And then as they begin to move in toward impact, you can see the player on the left maxes out his ribcage sway about left arm parallel at 1.6. And the player on the right maxes that out a little later at about 4. Now, by impact, let's run them down into impact, we're going to see that both players are backing up. So their rib cage is backing up about 2 inches from the maximum it moved forward into impact. And you can see the pelvis is forward in both players. One of them is forward about 3 inches, the other about 5. And so there's a differential in both players of about 3 inches of how much their lower body is forward of their upper body. And then they begin to recenter. So by the time they're into their follow-through, the centers are right back stacked up on top of each other. So that's pretty cool. Now let's see what changes with driver. And here we have the same two players at address with driver. And you can see now the upper center of mass and the lower center of mass are a little bit closer to stacked up at address. And then as we move these players into their backswings, we will see the player on the left, once again, his sway numbers for both pelvis and rib cage are almost lining up. So he's staying basically stacked up. And the same pattern is holding true with the player on the right. He is seeing just a little bit more sway in the upper body, so his rib cage is moving a little more off the ball than his lower body is in the backswing. And one of the key pieces here is, in both swings, the sway numbers max out pretty early in the backswing. You won't see them moving off the ball anymore really after they get to left arm parallel in the backswing. From this point forward, you'll pretty much see them starting to recenter. So you can see those numbers are starting to get smaller, and they haven't started their downswings yet. And once again, the player on the left, he is basically stacked up. So his upper center and his lower center are stacked right on top of each other at the top. And the player on the right, he's got just a little bit more sway in about 2 inches more sway in the backswing with his upper body than his lower body. But again, as they start down, both of these players will look really similar by the end of the transition phase. So when they get down here to more or less left arm parallel, you can see their hips have re-squared up, and they both have their bodies basically exactly stacked on top of each other. Now this allows them to really begin to use their legs and push their upper bodies back to really create a lot of speed into the golf ball. And at impact, you can see the numbers are, the pelvis is now 2.1 inches farther forward in the player on the left, while the chest is now 1.8 inches farther back than it started. And the player on the right is 3.8 inches farther forward, so he moved a little bit more forward with his lower body, and his upper center is basically exactly where it started. So the geometry is almost the same with both players. They're both around their upper center moved backward around 3 inches by impact. Just the player on the left tends to stay a little bit more centered. But both of these are awesome golf swings. Both make over 120 miles an hour of club head speed.
So a really cool drill to master this feeling is to practice taking the club to the top. And now as we begin our transition, we sit down, we turn, and we make sure that our upper body is ahead of our lower body. So the feeling is that the lead side of our body is getting lower. If the lead side of our body is getting lower in transition, then we're in perfect position to be like the great ball strikers in the world.